So, Mr. Mallard, you're charged with two cases. You're charged with driving while intoxicated, second offense. You're also charged with resisting arrest.
The officer observed the defendant's vehicle stopped on the road facing the wrong side, forcing multiple vehicles to drive around the defendant's vehicle. The officer observed the defendant's vehicle's engine on, with the defendant sitting in the driver's seat, appearing to be sleeping or passed out. The vehicle was in drive with the defendant's foot on the brake. The officer observed an open container of Bacardi rum, 750 milliliter bottle, approximately 10% full, sitting in the front right passenger seat, and the officer attempted several times to wake the defendant unsuccessfully, which led to the officer being forced to break the defendant's front right window to get into the motor vehicle due to the doors being locked. The officer placed the vehicle into park, and the defendant was asked to step out, who immediately fell to the ground. The officer observed slurred speech, red bloodshot eyes, a strong odor of an alcoholic beverage, and poor balance. The defendant refused any standard field sobriety test, and the defendant advised he had not consumed any alcoholic beverages, wished to speak to his lawyer, and was loudly repeating no consent to all questions. The defendant was read the DIC and refused breath. A blood search warrant was signed and executed. The defendant was transported to HCA Southeast ER to obtain blood, and the defendant refused to exit the officer's motor vehicle, even when the officer asked multiple times. The officer had to physically guide the defendant out of the vehicle, and the defendant stopped walking while walking to the ER with the officer and advised he wanted to go to the Veterans Hospital. The officer advised the defendant he had a search warrant, and the defendant refused to move. The officer grasped the defendant's upper arm and advised the defendant again of the search warrant, and the defendant refused to move. The officer advised the defendant that if he had to pull him inside, he was facing additional charges. The defendant again refused to move. The defendant advised he wanted to go to the VA hospital, and the defendant started pulling away in the direction away from the entrance to the hospital. The officer attempted to pull the defendant to the entrance, and the defendant continued to pull away. The defendant went dead weight and laid down on the ground outside and refused to move while screaming at the top of his lungs, "Someone help me." The officer was assisted by hospital security in placing the defendant in a wheelchair, allowing transport into the hospital, and the defendant's blood was only able to be drawn with assistance of 3 officers holding the defendant down.
My goodness. Can you run his NCIC? Does he also have a felony DWI with a child as well?
It was reduced to a DWI just above a 0.15.
If you have a problem with alcohol, you better address it, Mr. Mallard. Because if you don't, I'm going to do it for you. I don't want you out in the middle of the night, and I'm now giving you a curfew. You are not allowed out past 9 p.m. to 6 a.m., and I'm going to put a monitor on your ankle so I know that you're not out in the middle of the night. On your other ankle, I'm going to put a Scram monitor